In the 12th year of his rule, on a day considered fortunate by the priests, Sargon of Assyria resolved to create something entirely his own, a new city and a royal residence that would carry only his memory. The older capitals were filled with the shadows of former kings. Their walls spoke of earlier triumphs, their reliefs celebrated hunts and wars fought by men long dead, and every hall reminded visitors that Sargon was merely the latest in a long procession of rulers. He desired a place where history would begin with him alone. After long reflection, he chose a village called Maganuba, lying northeast of Nineveh, on a broad and fertile plain between the Kosa River and the distant Musri Hills. The land yielded 2 harvests each year, and a sulphurous stream there was believed to cure a painful skin illness, common in the region. Despite these advantages, none of the previous monarchs had thought to settle there. Sargon, convinced by both practical and symbolic reasons, decided to build his city on this ground and ordered the removal of the local inhabitants. Compensation was carefully arranged. Some received payment in silver and copper, others were granted new fields of equal value. Justice in this matter was essential, for it was believed that even one wronged owner could curse the future of the city. Founding a city was not merely an administrative act, but a sacred undertaking. The site had to be purified, the boundaries blessed, and divine guardians invited to reside within the walls. Sargon sought the favour of the great gods, especially Hea and Damkina, and prayed in the temple of Ishtar at Nineveh for approval. Encouraged by the oracles, he gathered workers and materials from across the empire. The plan called for a vast square enclosure covering hundreds of acres, its sides aligned with the cardinal directions. A foundation of stone slabs was laid first, and within it were buried clay figurines, inscribed cylinders, and amulets intended to repel evil. Above this sacred base rose walls of sun-dried brick, the traditional material favoured by Assyrian builders. These bricks could only be made during the month dedicated to the god of foundations. The king himself presided over the rituals. He lit the altar fire, poured libations, and sacrificed a bull before the clay was prepared. Mixed with straw, shaped and stamped with the royal name, the bricks slowly dried beneath the summer sun. Construction lasted 6 years, and the city was completed after Sargon returned from campaigns in the north. Fate allowed him little time to enjoy his creation. Not long after the inauguration, he was murdered, and the new capital, once intended as the heart of the empire, became only one residence among many. For most of the year its streets were quiet, its markets half empty. Only when a later king arrived with his court did the city awaken, filling again with life and ceremony. Approaching the city from Nineveh, travellers followed a broad stone road marked with distance posts. The fortifications appeared first, a massive outer wall strengthened by towers at regular intervals, high enough for chariots to pass along the top. 8 gates pierced the enclosure, each dedicated to a different deity. The main entrances were guarded by colossal stone bulls, with human faces and wings, symbols believed to defend the inhabitants not only from armies, but also from disease and malevolent spirits. These statues had been dragged from distant quarries by teams of prisoners and set in place with enormous effort. Inside the walls, the streets ran in straight lines, intersecting at right angles, for the city had been planned from the beginning rather than growing slowly over centuries. Houses were generally modest, with narrow doors and few windows, their flat roofs crowned by small domes. Near the gates stood large inns where merchants stored their goods and animals. Toward the centre rose finer dwellings and public buildings, and the traffic became more lively with carts, officials, and richly decorated chariots. The population reflected the vastness of the empire. After each conquest, thousands of captives had been relocated here. People from the mountains, the deserts, and the far coasts. Over time, they adopted Assyrian dress and language, yet their faces still revealed diverse origins. Some bore the features of Western Semites, others, the fair colouring of northern tribes. Others, again, the look of the highlands. These communities, once strangers, slowly blended into a single urban society held together by imperial authority. The palace rises on the northeast edge of the city, positioned so that it belongs to the urban world but also looks outward toward open ground. It does not sit on level streets like ordinary buildings. Instead, it stands on a massive man-made platform of brickwork, a broad raised terrace that lifts the complex above the rooftops. From below, the palace seems to dominate the settlement by sheer height as much as by authority. Access is controlled and carefully staged. People arriving on foot can reach the platform only from inside the city, climbing a wide double staircase that forces them to slow down and approach in full view. Riders and carts take a different route, moving up a long, gentle ramp that curves along the side of the terrace and ends near tall, bright walls on the eastern face. From that elevated approach, the king can move directly into the heart of the complex without struggling through crowds or narrow streets. At the highest point stands a tower-like vantage from which the ruler can scan the surrounding countryside. In a crisis, that position could remain defensible, even if the lower city were taken. Two main gateways match the two approaches. One faces outward and leads toward the royal living quarters. The other turns toward the city and watches the stairway. From far away, the entrance is easy to identify because of the tall standards mounted on poles above the gate, visible across the plain like signals of royal presence. The central passage is framed by heavy towers, and the lower parts of the facade are decorated with protective figures and animal forms meant to intimidate intruders and warn that this is not an ordinary threshold. The most ceremonial arch is reserved for the king himself. Lesser side entrances take in everyone else. Beyond the gates lies an enormous open court that functions almost like a small town within the palace walls. It is not quiet or private. Merchants, petitioners, officials, and curious visitors move through it constantly. The king's household is an empire in miniature, requiring thousands of workers and specialists. Some are administrators who manage money, records, and correspondence. Others handle security, deliveries, cooking, cleaning, transport, and the endless chores that keep such a place alive. Guards rotate in and out, couriers arrive with messages and leave again at speed. Officials come to request decisions and return to implement them. Pack animals bring food and supplies day after day. At dawn and again toward evening, lines of enslaved workers carry water from nearby channels to meet the needs of the complex. Storage buildings occupy much of the space around the court. There are rooms for wine and oil, for weapons and metalwork, for copper and goods taken as tribute, and for the valuables that form the king's treasury. Nearby are bakeries and kitchens. Not far away, stables connect to areas for camels and horses, and to sheds that house chariots and harness. In one corner stands a dense cluster of small dim living quarters for palace servants. Families are lodged there at the king's expense and kept close to their duties, forming a workforce that never truly leaves the institution. A discreet door leads from this public court into the women's quarters, and the contrast is immediate. In Assyrian cities, many ordinary women could walk freely through streets and markets. They could manage property, inherit, trade, and give testimony in court. Yet within the elite world of the palace, social reality narrowed. High-status women might possess wealth and legal standing, but their movement was heavily restricted. When they left their rooms, they were surrounded by attendants and guarded escorts, who blocked their view and limited their contact with anyone outside. Royal women were the most constrained of all. Rarely seen, receiving only selected family members and trusted figures of the household. Sargon's household included multiple royal wives, and the women's quarters were arranged accordingly. Rather than one single residence, the harem was divided into separate units, each with its own internal space, while certain courtyards and passages served as shared areas. The entrances were decorated to project beauty and fertility, using motifs associated with growth and abundance. Inside, the layout followed a predictable pattern. An outer room for receiving attendants, a larger sitting space with part of it open to the sky and part sheltered beneath a rounded roof, a short stair, and then the private sleeping chamber. The interiors were finished in pale plaster with dark trim at the base of the walls. Floors were paved or carefully laid in brick. Furnishings were simple but comfortable. Mats, textiles, low stools, small tables, and wooden beds raised on legs. For royal wives, daily life was structured and repetitive. Clothing, embroidery, household supervision, long hours of conversation with servants, and small ceremonies filled the time. They visited one another and held entertainments with music and dance, turning routine into ritual. Occasionally, the king appeared to spend time with them, or he invited them to dine and enjoy the palace gardens. But contact with the outside remained limited. Even visits from noblewomen were controlled, because any outside connection could become a channel for influence or escape. Behind this calm surface, rivalries could become dangerous. In a household where several women competed for the attention of one man, affection was not simply personal, it was political. A small sign of favour could raise anxiety among the others. If preference became visible, fear hardened into jealousy, and jealousy into something darker. Alliances formed, servants took sides, and quiet plots grew within an environment designed to appear orderly. In such settings, a sudden illness or a carefully prepared cup could remove a rival without open conflict, leaving no obvious trace except a shift in power. The king's own living area lay apart from the harem and away from the busy public court. It faced toward the side where the ramp reaches the upper level, allowing the ruler to arrive on horseback or in a chariot and enter directly. Even here, protection and symbolism were built into the architecture. Monumental guardians marked the entrance, and inside, lines of motionless attendants stood with lowered heads and controlled posture, turning the king's passage into a ritual of dominance. He crossed courtyards and corridors until reaching a central honor court that functioned as the core of the private palace. Despite the scale of the complex, the king's personal suite was not necessarily vast. It was arranged for daily work as much as for comfort. Rooms where he slept, ate, met advisors, examined reports, and issued instructions under the watch of eunuchs and secretaries. Beyond these were larger ceremonial halls, where courtiers and senior officials waited to be summoned, standing in silence for long periods in spaces designed to impress them with order and hierarchy. Light entered from above through openings in vaulted roofs, producing a dim, controlled atmosphere that kept the interiors cool and solemn. Along the walls, long bands of painted reliefs displayed the official story of kingship. They showed the ruler receiving equipment for war or travel, with attendants carrying elaborate objects, special drinking vessels, ceremonial furniture, and even wheeled platforms that turned a throne into something mobile and theatrical. Other scenes presented hunting and warfare, the king pursuing wild animals or leading armies across distant landscapes. The artists included small details to mark different regions: trees that suggest mountain country, cultivated vines that signal a settled district, rivers filled with fish and creatures rendered with surprising care. The images were designed to make one message unavoidable: wherever the king goes, the world is ordered around him. Writing was present too, but it did not dominate the surface as heavily as in earlier traditions. The long texts were not meant to interrupt the figures or clutter the scenes. Instead, the most extensive records were placed out of sight, hidden on the reverse sides of slabs, or in spaces that ordinary eyes would never examine. The logic behind this secrecy was almost philosophical. Palaces, no matter how well built, do not last forever. Dynasties fade, capitals change, new rulers replace the old. When the city is finally abandoned and the halls stand empty, later generations will uncover those concealed records and reconstruct what the living court once tried to control. Religious space was integrated into the palace complex rather than separated from it. Near the gardens and close to both the women's quarters and the king's residence stood rooms reserved for the gods and their servants. The building was less regular than the palace halls, but its interiors followed familiar patterns: white walls, dark base trim, and simple decorative paintings that included animals and symbolic figures. Priests and sacred attendants lived and worked there in an isolation that, in its own way, echoed the seclusion of the harem. Their days were shaped by ritual, study, and the maintenance of the practices believed to keep the state safe. Assyria's king was not treated as a god born from divine blood, in the way some other monarchies imagined their rulers. His lineage, as recorded, was human. Yet his authority was inseparable from religion. He stood as the chief guardian of national worship. He performed sacrifices on behalf of the people, led major festivals, and alone entered the innermost sacred spaces. He claimed direct access to the divine world, speaking to the gods and receiving guidance. No major undertaking was supposed to begin without signs of approval. When armies marched, favourable omens were demanded. When victory brought booty and tribute, a fixed share was set aside for the gods, and the priests benefited from the ruler's public gratitude. Power in Assyria is wrapped in ritual, but it is not surrendered to ritual. The king can be deeply devout and still remain stubbornly in control. Temples matter, omens matter, the favour of the gods matters, yet the priesthood is not allowed to become a rival court. In other lands, rulers have been forced to bow to powerful clergy, or even to fight them for the throne. In Assyria, that line is never crossed. No Assyrian monarch is remembered as a man who lowered his head and handed the state to the hands of priests. The gods are honoured, but the government stays firmly royal. Even so, royal devotion has its preferences. Sargon's descendants develop a particular attachment to Ishtar, the great goddess associated with Nineveh and Arbela. She becomes more than a name in formal prayers. Kings speak of her as a personal protector, a force that goes ahead of them in danger. In official language, she appears as a presence that rides with the army, that stands in the chaos of battle, that pushes fear into the enemy and steadies the king. Later, rulers call upon her in their most serious moments, sometimes almost to the exclusion of other deities. That devotion brings wealth to her sanctuaries and prestige to her servants, but it still does not translate into political power. The priests may grow richer, they may stand closer during ceremonies, they may receive gifts and shares of offerings, yet the king does not invite them into the machinery of rule. This balance is visible in stone and brick. In Egypt, the temple is built as if it must stand forever, heavy and immovable, while the royal residence can be lighter, easier to rebuild, more vulnerable to time. In Assyria, the message is reversed. the palace overwhelms the sacred buildings in sheer scale and splendor. On the raised platform of the citadel, most of the space is claimed by the ruler, his household, his guards, his storehouses, his administrative rooms, his courts, and the routes that keep his system moving. The religious quarter exists, but it feels placed to the side, almost as if it is included by necessity rather than by desire. The priests are given their rooms, their corridors, their rituals, but they do not occupy the center. The gods, however, are not treated as secondary. Their sanctuary rises higher than everything else because height is a language that ancient Mesopotamia understands instinctively. At the edge of the platform, above the palace terraces and above the city wall, the temple tower lifts itself upward like a deliberate challenge to the sky. People in the river lands have long told a famous story about human beings who tried to build a city and a tower that would reach the heavens. In that tale, the builders shaped bricks, fired them hard and bound them with bitumen, believing that nothing could stop them. The gods, angered by the ambition, shattered their unity by confusing their speech and scattering them across the earth. Many still point to the great tower at Babylon and say it is a remnant of that proud attempt. Whether taken as legend or warning, the story reveals a deep idea. Height is never neutral. It is aspiration, defiance, and prayer all at once. The earliest builders in the Mesopotamian world pursued sacred grandeur, not by spreading outward in long horizontal lines, but by climbing upward in stacked stages. The result was the ziggurat, a towering mass of brick rising in receding levels. From a distance, it can resemble a stepped mountain made by human hands, severe and geometric, more like a sculpted cliff than a building meant for comfort. A ramp or stair climbs along the faces, turning and winding as it ascends, forcing any approach to become a slow, exposed progression. It is not designed to welcome crowds to a spacious interior. It is designed to lift a holy place above the ordinary world. At Dur-Sarukin, the temple tower rises high above the esplanade, a massive structure of 7 stages. Each level is dedicated to a celestial power, tied in popular imagination to the visible planets, and each stage carries a distinct colour that marks its divine association. One level shines pale, another is dark, another carries a deep tone like bruised purple, another is blue, another burns with red, another gleams as if coated in metal, and the highest stage glitters with gold. From below, the tower looks like a vertical map of the sky, translated into pigments and minerals and sunlight. The structure itself is mostly solid, not hollow. It is a mountain of brick with a sacred purpose, not a complex of rooms. At the top sits a small shrine, modest in size compared to the bulk beneath it, yet loaded with meaning. The roof is shaped like a dome and plated so that it catches the light. 2 altars stand ready for offerings. A statue holds the goddess's presence in a form the eye can grasp. A bed and ritual objects complete the space, not as decoration but as practical tools for the ceremonies performed there. This summit chamber is not a public sanctuary, it is restricted. Only priests of rank and the king himself can enter without committing sacrilege. The logic is simple. The city might belong to thousands, but the direct presence of the goddess belongs to the state, and the state is embodied by the monarch. In the belief system of the time, the statue is not merely symbolic. It is treated as an anchor, a place where the spirit of the deity can settle, dwell, and listen. From that height, the goddess watches the city beneath her, receives petitions, and sends warnings through prophets and signs. She is expected to reveal dangers before they arrive, to guide the king toward decisions that keep the land secure, and to strengthen the invisible boundary between order and chaos. Every morning, the upper stage flashes when the sun strikes the gilded surface. The glow hangs between earth and sky like a deliberate beacon. Travellers on distant roads recognise it long before they can make out city walls or gates. That bright point becomes a kind of promise: shelter, water, markets, safety, and the presence of power. The tired rider urges animals forward when the light appears. When the traveller leaves again, the reflection seems to follow for a time, fading only after the city's noise has vanished behind the horizon. Beyond the citadel, ordinary life keeps its own rhythms, and the story turns from kings and towers to the people who live under their shadow. Commerce runs through the empire like a pulse. On the Tigris, traders use round boats made of woven frames sealed with skins. Their shape is practical rather than elegant, built to float heavy cargo down a swift current. Straw is laid on the bottom, goods are packed tightly, more straw is stuffed into gaps, and animals are sometimes carried as well. The boats are not meant to travel back upstream. Once a merchant reaches his destination and sells what he can, the vessel is often broken down and the skins are loaded onto donkeys for the return by land. The river trade is profitable, but it is never gentle. The Tigris can behave like a violent creature, changing mood without warning. A boat can be dragged into a sudden whirl, slammed against a bank, or split by hidden forces in the current. Even if water does not destroy the cargo, humans might. Riverbank communities can be dangerous, offering bad guidance or demanding payment for safe passage. Officials stationed along the way can be just as threatening in a quieter manner, squeezing merchants for gifts and fees beyond what law permits. Bribes and presents become a routine cost of doing business. The result is a constant calculation: high risk balanced by high reward. Inside the heartland of Assyria, security is tighter. The kings want roads controlled, punish banditry harshly, and make a show of protecting movement between major cities. A lone traveller can sometimes ride without fear in those central regions. The danger grows the moment a caravan pushes toward the edges of empire and beyond. Outside the core, merchants prefer to travel in groups. Even then, safety is never guaranteed. Nomads, professional raiders, petty local nobles, and even rulers on the route can decide that plunder is easier than trade. Goods can vanish into private pockets or be seized for treasuries. Men can be killed or sold. A trader lives between three possible endings: wealth, captivity, or death. Still, commerce continues because waiting for a perfectly safe world would mean never moving at all. Near one of Dur Sarakin's gates stands the house of a merchant. From the street, it looks much like any other building, because private life does not advertise itself outwardly. The entrance is a small arched doorway and a narrow passage that turns the visitor away from the eyes of strangers. Then the space opens into a central courtyard around which the rooms are arranged. A shaded gallery runs along the edges, supported by posts and a light awning. Many rooms are not living spaces but storage, because wealth in this world is often measured in grain, cloth, oil, tools, and trade goods, rather than in coins alone. Some ceilings are vaulted, others are flat and supported by palm trunks. Above, a terrace roof spreads across the structure, reached by a steep staircase. The roof is not a decorative feature. It is a working space and a social space, especially for women. In the cool hours of morning, women climb up to knead dough, prepare food, wash cloth, lay out linens to dry, and speak across the open air from one rooftop to another. Even when households own slaves, the terrace remains a place to sit, to weave, to embroider, to share news. When the heat becomes oppressive, the household retreats indoors. The coolest room is often partly sunk below courtyard level, dim and protected from the sun. Its floor is hard and smooth, its walls coated in fine plaster. During summer, Water is sprinkled across the surfaces so the air cools as it evaporates. A simple technique that makes the room bearable when the streets outside shimmer with heat. Furnishings remain plain even among the comfortable. Stools and chairs come in a few standard forms. Most people sleep on mats, while richer rooms may contain wooden beds, raised on carved feet shaped like lions' paws. In the courtyard sits a baking oven. Skins of wine and jars of water hang where air can cool them. A pot simmers over an outdoor fire. Daily meals depend on status. The poor rely on bread, vegetables, oil, salt, and river fish. The rich dine in abundance, sometimes reclining as they eat, perfuming themselves before banquets and treating food as a ritual display. Formal feasts may separate men and women, while ordinary days are more flexible, with the household sharing dishes in a practical rhythm. But comfort is never seen as complete without protection from what cannot be seen. In this world, unseen forces are treated as practical threats. Illness, misfortune, nightmares, sudden rage, unexplained weakness, and bad luck are not always interpreted as accidents. They are often attributed to hostile spirits, to envy, to invisible attackers. For that reason, amulets and protective figures appear everywhere. Over doors, near beds, beside entrances, buried under thresholds, placed where the house meets the street and where the family sleeps. The idea is not decoration. It is defense. Some protective figures are frightening by design. They represent destructive beings in grotesque form so that the demon, forced to face its own image, will flee. One common fear is a scorching wind imagined as a malignant spirit, a force that dries crops and brings fever. Its image may combine animal parts into a nightmare body, a canine torso, bird-like legs, claws, wings, a tail like a scorpion, and a gaunt human head crowned with horns. The ugliness is intentional. It is meant to repel. Other images take different forms, sometimes known only in local tradition, sometimes tied to the great gods themselves, compelled by ritual formulas to stand guard over a single household. Protection is not passive. Offerings are made to these guardians. Food and drink are set out, as if the invisible defenders must be fed for their service. Incantations are spoken to keep the boundaries strong. When a merchant returns from travel, he may recite words at the doorway to prevent any harmful influence from crossing into the home with him. The formula names what is feared: fever, pestilence, wasting sickness, hostile spirits, envy, slander, the destructive glance, the malignant whisper. The words demand that these forces be driven away from the body, away from the threshold, away from the roof beams, away from the rooms where children sleep. The speech is not poetry for entertainment. It is practical religion, a verbal shield. Inside the courtyard, after animals are stabled and goods carried into storerooms, family business begins at once. The wife reports what happened during the merchant's absence, the behaviour of servants, the work completed in weaving and dyeing, the loans extended, the profits expected. Even ordinary households participate in finance. Silver lent at interest can multiply quickly. A son old enough to manage transactions becomes a partner in the family's future, learning to buy, sell, bargain, and secure property that will support his own household. A young man who plans to marry often seeks land, because land provides stability. A field is inspected for soil quality, water access, and distance from the city. Irrigation channels or streams can transform a section into gardens, producing vegetables for markets. Bargaining follows. Days pass with negotiations and adjustments. When agreement is finally reached, the sale is formalized before an authority. Contracts are not casual promises. They are legal objects written by professionals, and witnessed publicly. The scribes work quickly with soft clay tablets and a stylus that presses wedge-shaped marks into the surface. Multiple copies are made at once because trust is never absolute. Copies prevent fraud and keep the terms clear if disputes arise later. Once written, the deeds are read aloud so that everyone hears the boundaries, the price, the obligations, and the penalties for anyone who tries to cancel the deal in the future. Heavy fines discourage false claims, and the language is designed to make the agreement feel irreversible. Seals are then rolled or stamped into the clay, each witness leaving a distinct mark. When finished, the tablets are baked, turning fragile clay into a permanent record. Land acquired in a father's name can be transferred immediately to a son, setting the foundation for marriage. Marriage here is not only a private bond, but a legal arrangement backed by contracts and witnessed agreements. Families debate the best path. Some customs treat marriage as a purchase, especially among the poor, where a bride price can secure a girl's future in a household that can feed her. Other arrangements focus on dowries and alliances between families of similar standing. Contracts may include conditions about divorce and penalties meant to discourage repudiation. In some cases, the language is harsh, designed less to predict behaviour than to protect a husband's financial interests. The law can treat a wife as legally tied to the contract in ways that make leaving difficult, and families who attempt to reclaim a woman may face penalties as if they were challenging a sale. Yet wealthier households aim for a different match. A merchant family may prefer a bride who brings education, skill, and a respectable connection. The search often happens through women's networks, neighbours, relatives, friends who can gain access to another household's private quarters. A promising girl is described not only by beauty, but by capability. Managing a home, producing textiles, playing music, reading and writing, behaving with discipline. Her father's reputation matters. His honesty, his business stability, his land prospects, and his standing in the district become part of the negotiation. If the match is approved, the official request is made by the men, and the bargaining begins. Dowry discussions can last hours. Each side starts high or low, pressing for advantage, until both arrive at what they quietly knew was reasonable. Silver, servants, furniture, textiles, and household goods are calculated carefully. A wedding date is chosen with attention to auspicious timing. Preparations, though intense, are usually practical. Many items are already made. Clothing woven and embroidered in advance, servants who have grown up in the household, furniture purchased from markets. On the wedding day, the two families gather. Men assemble in reception rooms. Women gather in the private quarters around the bride. An official writer arrives to prepare the contract. An interpreter of signs or an astrologer may be consulted to declare the day favourable, because luck is treated as something that can be managed through timing. The bride's body is prepared with oils and perfumes. Hands and nails are stained red. Eyes and brows are darkened. Friends surround her, not only to help, but to fill the waiting with noise and laughter, because waiting itself is considered a precious stage of life. When the moment comes, the formalities are performed in front of witnesses. The offer is spoken aloud. The dowry is announced. The bride is escorted in and placed beside the groom. A symbolic gesture binds them in public. Hands joined, a thread tied, words spoken that turn private intention into recognized union. Blessings follow, and the language is carefully chosen. Praise is mixed with protective formulas, because too much admiration is believed to attract envy and invisible harm. The aim is not simply to celebrate, but to shield the couple at the very moment they are most exposed to attention. The moment the symbolic gestures are finished, an attentive professional steps forward. He has been watching the proceedings closely, waiting for the instant when words must become law. Now, he takes a soft clay tablet, sets it in his palm, and begins to press the signs into its surface. The marriage is no longer only a family agreement or a happy gathering. It becomes a recorded fact that can be produced later if anyone tries to deny what was done. The terms are written in plain, practical language. A father has formally requested a bride for his son. The girl's father has accepted. A dowry is listed item by item so there can be no confusion later. A measured amount of silver, a small group of household servants named individually, furniture suitable for a new household, and even a strip of land assigned as part of the settlement. There is also a guarantee, because promises about payment are treated with caution. A servant is temporarily transferred as security until a sum of silver is fully delivered. When the payment is completed, the servant is returned. It is a hard system, but it is consistent with the way this society turns every major step in life into an enforceable contract. The witnesses then add their marks. Some press a simple nail-like impression into the clay. Others roll a seal. Each signature is a statement that the agreement was seen, understood, and accepted by those present. The celebration does not end there. An older woman in the family, proud of the match and eager to display approval, expands the dowry with an additional gift. 2 more servants are added, and because any transfer of people or property must be protected from future disputes, the gift is written down as its own separate document. The language is different in tone now, less like negotiation and more like certainty. It declares that the gift is voluntary, that it belongs to the bride, and that anyone who attempts to reverse it will be cursed by the gods. The purpose is simple: to prevent relatives, creditors, or jealous rivals from returning years later to claim what has already been assigned. Once the tablet has been read aloud and the markings are set, the legal part of the marriage is finished. Religion has already touched the day through the spoken blessings and the binding of hands, but it does not dominate the paperwork. After that brief sacred moment, the rest is the world of households and community. Food arrives, low tables are carried in, cups are filled. The father of the bride opens his house widely, more widely than usual, because this is the kind of day when privacy is suspended. The guests eat and drink for hours. Music follows, then dancing. Performers take their turns. A harp, a flute, a singer whose voice rises above the courtyard noise, entertainers who juggle or show feats of strength, storytellers who keep the crowd laughing or leaning in to hear the next line. The atmosphere grows louder and warmer as neighbours drift in. Many are not close friends, yet they come because weddings are public victories. They congratulate the families, accept hospitality, and confirm by their presence that the union is recognised by the whole district. As daylight fades, the mood changes. Now, the bride must leave her childhood home. This departure is treated as a serious threshold, and custom demands a certain kind of sorrow. A well-raised girl is expected to cry. She clings to her mother. She hesitates. She delays her steps. The tears are real, but they are also a signal that she understands what is happening. She is not simply walking to another house. She is crossing into a new identity. At last, she moves out into the street, surrounded by companions. Torches flare. Women make sharp, piercing cries that announce joy in a way that can be heard across rooftops. Musicians lead the procession. Servants carry chests and furniture ahead of the bride, followed by others who guide the gifts and the dowry through the streets. People come to doorways and corners to watch. A wedding procession is a spectacle, and the crowd grows as it advances, flowing behind it like a moving wall of voices. At the groom's house, the young man waits with his friends. He receives the bride at the threshold, a symbolic act that marks her entry into his household. The festivities begin again almost immediately. More wine, more food, more music. The public celebration continues even after the couple withdraws into the private quarters, because the household is not only joining two people, it is marking a new alliance that benefits the wider family network. For several days, the city keeps hearing echoes of this event: small gatherings, repeated meals, visits between relatives, the slow distribution of gifts and responsibilities. Then, as always, routine returns. The bride learns the rhythms of her new household. She adapts to a different courtyard, different servants, different expectations. The mother-in-law watches carefully, because harmony inside the house matters as much as profit in the market. In time, the older woman begins to feel satisfied. The bride appears diligent and capable, the sort of person who strengthens a household rather than destabilizes it. She works with textiles, manages stores, speaks carefully, rises early, keeps order among servants, and maintains the dignity that families value. In a society built on reputation, this kind of quiet competence becomes a form of wealth. Not long after, another story begins in the same neighborhood, and it begins without a clear cause. A merchant who has returned to comfort and normal life slowly becomes withdrawn. His energy fades, his mood darkens, he sleeps poorly, wakes in distress, and cannot explain what has changed. People around him search for meaning, because illness is rarely treated as random. Each person is believed to live under the care of a personal divine protector. When life goes well, the protector is thought to be near. When a man weakens without reason, it is interpreted as withdrawal, as if the invisible guardian has stepped back and left the person exposed. The man turns to prayer, not with calm confidence, but with the voice of someone who feels abandoned. He describes nights spent in tears, days filled with sighing, strength trapped inside a failing body. He speaks of legs that stumble, ears that ring, a hammering inside the skull. In modern terms, it could sound like exhaustion or severe migraine, but in this world it is given a name. It is treated as a hostile force that has entered him. People speak of a headache god, as if pain itself is a being with intent. Assyria does not rely on a medical school that separates disease into rationale categories. The specialist called to the house is not a physician in the later sense. He is an exorcist trained to read symptoms as evidence of spiritual attack. He studies the man's eyes and face, asks how the sickness began, and listens for patterns that suggest a specific enemy. His verdict is grim. He does not claim this is a simple ailment. He says the man has been targeted. Someone has spoken harmful words against him. A spell has been set in motion. The illness is not only inside the body, it is outside it too, hanging around him like a cloak. The exorcist prepares a ritual designed to reverse the damage by forcing the great gods to intervene. Ideally, these ceremonies belong in sacred precincts, but the patient is too weak to travel, so the specialist agrees to perform the work in the house. He arrives with written charms, herbs he has gathered himself, and the objects needed for a fire rite. He removes his shoes, purifies himself, and lights a brazier on the floor. Aromatic plants burn with a clean flame. The room fills with heat and sharp scent. The first part is spoken as diagnosis and accusation. The exorcist describes the curse in a rhythmic chant, naming it as a demon-like force that lashes the victim. He declares that the man's divine protector has stepped away, and that this absence has allowed the attack to cling to him. Then the tone shifts from threat to rescue. The chant speaks of the high gods being alerted, of a divine conversation in which the remedy is revealed. The goal is to make the ritual feel authorized from above, not invented by the human specialist. The The cure is performed in stages, each one acting out the destruction of the evil. The sick man is washed and sprinkled with scented water. Then, at the brazier, the exorcist takes a clove of garlic, peels it, and burns it at piece by piece while speaking. The logic is symbolic but direct. As the garlic is destroyed and can never be replanted, so the curse will be destroyed and will not return. The sick man repeats the key lines after him, asking that the disease be consumed like the offering. Next, a date is cut up and thrown into the fire, again with words that insist the malady will be cut apart and devoured by flame. Then come other items, burned one after another, a flowering branch, small leaves, strands of wool, animal hair, dyed thread. Each object is chosen for its meaning. Once burned, it cannot return to what it was. The ritual insists that the illness will suffer the same fate. By the end, the sick man is shaking. His body has followed the ritual with effort, repeating words, lifting hands, enduring smoke and heat. When it is over, he collapses. In this system, collapse can be interpreted as proof that the right has struck its target. The struggle between forces is believed to be violent, and the body is expected to pay the price. The exorcist then speaks a final invocation to the fire itself, treating it as a divine ally that has purified the house and consumed the curse. But time passes and the improvement does not come. The ritual is repeated morning and night, yet the man weakens further. The household begins to fear that the divine protector is not returning. The sickness feels as if it is winning. In desperation, the family turns to a public custom. The man is carried on a bed into the open, to the area near a city gate where officials sit and where crowds gather. The logic is practical. Among many people, there may be someone who has seen this before and knows what helped. The family exposes the illness to the gaze of passers-by and invites questions. Some keep their distance, afraid the condition may spread, or afraid the attacking spirit might leap from one body to another. Others are simply curious. Friends look with pity and speak quietly about how quickly fortune turns. Advice floods in. One person suggests different incantations, older formulas, stronger bindings. Another argues that a woman skilled in magic should tie knots around the patient's head and limbs to keep the soul from slipping away. Someone else recommends making a clay figure and pouring wine over it, while reciting words, transferring the illness into the substitute. Another claims a paste made of crushed woods and strange ingredients, swallowed quickly, has cured the same torment. Each remedy is delivered with confidence because confidence is part of persuasion, and persuasion is part of hope. For a moment, the sunlight and noise seem to stir the patient. Then, the stimulation becomes unbearable. He is carried home again, and a heavy stupor settles over him. Exorcisms continue. Remedies are attempted. The household calls his name, pleads with him, tries to pull him back into awareness. It does not work. The people who live between the Tigris and the Euphrates do not hide their sorrow when death enters a house. Grief bursts outward in sound and movement. As soon as life leaves a body, relatives rush together, especially the women. Clothes are torn, cheeks and chests are scratched, dust is poured over the hair and cries echo through the streets. The mourning is not private. The entire neighbourhood is drawn into the lament, whether it wishes to be or not. Yet beneath these familiar scenes, the treatment of the dead follows a path very different from that of other ancient lands. These communities believe that death does not end existence. Only one part of a person fades with the body. Another element continues, not forever perhaps, but long beyond the final breath. Still, they do not imagine that the soul depends on the preservation of flesh. If the body decays, the spirit does not perish with it. The The dead are not indifferent to what happens to their remains, and injury to a corpse is thought to trouble the wandering soul. Burning or mutilation is feared, and a body left to the birds is considered a great misfortune. Yet the desire to keep a corpse intact for centuries is absent. The long and careful transformations practiced elsewhere have no place here. Instead, the body is washed, scented, dressed, and returned to the earth quickly, often within a single day. In the house of Edina, the familiar rites begin. Elderly women take charge. They cleanse the body with water, rub it with perfumed oil, and clothe it in a ceremonial robe. Colour is restored to the cheeks, the eyelids are darkened, rings are placed on the fingers, and a collar is fastened around the neck. The arms are folded across the chest, and the body is laid upon a bed. An altar stands nearby with water, incense, and small cakes. It is believed that dangerous spirits hover around the dead, seeking either to consume the body or to use it for their own dark purposes. If one of them were to enter the corpse, the dead might rise again as a creature that feeds upon the living. To prevent this, the family calls upon benevolent powers to guard the room. Invisible protectors are imagined at the head and foot of the bed, while others stand within the chamber ready to strike any hostile presence. The final hours are spent under the watch of these unseen guardians. The funeral begins early the next morning. The body is placed upon a bier carried by strong hands. Professional mourners lead the way, with musicians, and behind them come the family, dressed in rough, dark garments. Friends and neighbours follow, forming a long and slowly moving line. The same cries that filled the house now fill the streets. Between the wails, people speak of the uncertainty of life, repeating the phrases that every generation has used. They remind one another that the hour of death is hidden from all, that a man alive at sunset may be gone before dawn. The procession leaves the city and moves toward one of the burial grounds, scattered across the plain. The landscape offers no cliffs or rocky hills where grand tombs might be cut. The soil is soft and damp, and anything buried within it soon decays. There are no vast stone monuments here, no eternal houses for the dead. The grave is a resting place rather than a fortress against time. Still, the soul is believed to linger near the body for a while, and the tomb is equipped with what might be needed. Food, drink, clothing, and small objects are placed beside the corpse. A well-treated spirit is thought to protect its descendants, while a neglected one may return to trouble them. Worst of all is the fate of the unburied. A soul without a tomb wanders hungry and desperate, rejected even by other spirits. Such a being may creep into homes at night, appearing in dreadful shapes, spreading illness and fear. To prevent this danger, every effort is made to secure a proper burial. The older generations once built their graves of brick, forming arched chambers or large clay jars sealed with bitumen. Bodies were laid upon mats, heads resting on bricks or cushions, hands folded over the chest. Around them were placed vessels of food and drink, weapons for men, ornaments for women. Over centuries, these graves formed low mounds, layer upon layer of forgotten lives. In the north, the traces are fewer, the structures lighter, and many have vanished beneath shifting earth. The resting places of kings are remembered more clearly. Tradition claims that ancient rulers lie beneath the palaces they once inhabited, guarded by the gods of their cities. Chroniclers have recorded the names of buildings that became royal tombs, and stories are told of ceremonies held to restore them after times of war. For ordinary people, however, the grave is only a temporary station. Beyond it lies a darker vision. Many imagine a distant realm beneath the earth or at the edge of the world, ruled by grim deities. A river marks its boundary, and 7 gates bar the way, the shades who enter are stripped of all they carried in life and brought naked before a terrible judge. Those who offend her suffer endless hunger, thirst, and disease. The others exist in a grey misery, clothed in feathers like birds of night, forever fluttering and lamenting. Once within, there is no return except as a fearful apparition sent to trouble the living. Yet this bleak picture has not satisfied every heart. People have begun to hope for a better destiny for the righteous. Tales speak of a bright island or a lofty mountain where heroes are welcomed among the gods. There, they wash their hands beside divine elders, eat pure food, and drink water that restores speech and strength. Piety on earth is believed to open this path, and repentance to erase many faults. The realm of darkness becomes the home of the ancient dead, while newer generations look upward toward a kinder future. Edina's family follows the traditional rites, though many no longer believe that his spirit will dwell beside the bones. They feel certain that he has already risen beyond the reach of the grave, guided by the powers he honoured in life. The offerings are made out of respect rather than fear, and the tomb is sealed with quiet confidence that the true meeting place lies far above, where clouds shine like silver and the pain of the world is left behind. While mourning fills one household, the life of the court continues. The king, Assurbanipal, has ridden out to hunt beyond the Zab, seeking the lions that still haunt the marshes. The chase resembles a military campaign, with guards, horsemen and servants moving like an army across the spring fields. The plain spreads green and fragrant, alive with gazelles and wild asses that scatter before the procession. After several fruitless days, word arrives of lions troubling a nearby village. The marsh where they hide is surrounded. Boats are placed across the river, and the hounds are unleashed. Through reeds taller than a man, the hunters advance. A lioness falls beneath a rain of arrows, and her mate flees into the thicket. The king pursues on foot, slipping through mud and tangled roots until he meets the beast beside the water. With one hand he seizes the mane, with the other he drives his lance deep into the chest. The animal collapses, and soon another is killed as it leaps towards the boat. The trophies are carried back to the camp in triumph, as with every royal success, a ceremony follows. The king pours wine over the bodies and offers thanks to the gods who granted victory. Later, the artists of the palace will carve the scene in stone so that future ages may see how the ruler faced the desert beast alone. Lions have grown scarce in these lands, hunted relentlessly by earlier kings. Many are now brought from distant regions, captured with cunning traps. Hunters dig deep pits edged with low walls, tie a living lamb to a post at the centre, and wait. Drawn by the cries, the lion leaps in and cannot escape. A cage is lowered with roasted meat, and once the hungry prisoner enters, the door is closed and the creature is hauled to the surface, bewildered and furious. The lions that reached Assyria were not always destined for immediate death. Some were carried along the great roads of the empire and placed within broad enclosures near the royal cities. These were not cages in the narrow sense, but wide-walled parks where the animals could wander with a certain freedom. Herds of goats were released inside so that the beasts might feed and grow strong, for a thin and weary lion gave little glory to a king. From time to time, the ruler himself arrived to enjoy the spectacle of hunting within these artificial wildernesses. On other occasions, a more dramatic stage was prepared. A cage was set in the centre of an open plain, and around it soldiers formed a living barrier, shoulder to shoulder, their shields and spears creating a moving wall of flesh. The keeper climbed onto a small wooden refuge built above the cage, raised the trapdoor, and waited in safety while the lion burst into the light. The animal would pause, stretch its powerful limbs, and survey the ring of men. Instinct quickly told it that escape was impossible. What followed was a deliberate imitation of the true hunt. The same weapons were used, the same maneuvers practiced. Arrows loosed from chariots, spears thrown from horseback, foot soldiers advancing in tight ranks. Yet the outcome was fixed from the beginning. Whenever the lion rushed toward a weak point in the line, the soldiers drove it back with shouts and blows, forcing it once more toward the royal hunter. The contest was real enough, for the beast fought with desperate courage, but its fate was sealed as surely as that of the wild bull that had once roamed these lands in freedom. The day was approaching when only carved images would preserve the memory of such scenes, and of the reckless bravery with which Assyrian kings had faced the creatures even in their dens. The campaign of Assurbanipal had opened with triumph, yet destiny seldom allows unbroken success. While the king dedicated his trophies to the goddess of battle, urgent news arrived from the capital. The Grand Vizier, left behind to govern in the monarch's absence, sent a swift messenger requesting his immediate return. An embassy from Elam had appeared on the frontier, carrying a demand that could not be ignored. The words were wrapped in courtesy, but their meaning was plain. Tuman, the ruler of Susiana, sought the surrender of the princes who had taken refuge in Assyria. The envoys hinted that their master desired only the heads of the exiles and would leave the rest of their bodies to Assurbanipal's mercy. To refuse an audience would be to declare war without preparation, and the vizier dared not assume such responsibility. The king, however, was less troubled than his advisers expected. The thrill of the hunt had sharpened his spirit, and the prospect of conflict with Elam did not frighten him any more than the charge of a wounded lion. He returned to the city with the same pomp that had marked his departure. The Susian princes watched his face anxiously, knowing that their lives hung in the balance, and they were relieved to find no shadow upon his brow. The soldiers, dreaming of plunder and rapid promotion, welcomed the rumour of war with open joy, and the people of the capital greeted their sovereign even more warmly than before as they saw the captured beasts carried through the gates. The day appointed for the reception of the Elamite ambassadors soon arrived. Assurbanipal ordered that they should be treated with every sign of respect, and the entire court assembled to honour them. The wealth of Assyria was displayed without restraint. A century of conquests had filled the palaces with the treasures of many nations. The remnants of Hittite power, the spoils of Babylon, the gold of Egypt and the riches of Phoenician traders lay stored within the royal chambers. Foreign merchants crowded the markets, bringing incense from Arabia, ivory from distant coasts, glass and fine linen from the Nile, cedar from the mountains, and metals from the highlands of the north. Even the lesser nobles lived amid luxuries gathered from the farthest edges of the known world. Yet this splendour differed from that of older civilizations. Egyptian elegance favoured simplicity and graceful form, while Assyrian taste delighted in heavy fabrics, bold colours, and embroidery crowded with figures. Men and women alike wore garments that concealed the shape of the body beneath stiff layers of ornament. The effect was imposing rather than delicate, designed to proclaim power rather than harmony. The king himself appeared in a costume intended to dazzle. His hair and beard were perfumed and arranged in careful curls. A tall white cap banded with blue rose above his brow. The robe beneath was deep in colour, edged with fringes that glittered with beads of glass. Over it lay a vest, thick with needlework, sacred trees, winged creatures, and scenes of royal triumph unfolded across the cloth like small paintings. Such textiles had become famous far beyond Assyria, carried by traders to lands where their meaning was no longer understood. Foreign artisans copied the shapes without knowing their story, and in distant countries these images came to represent new gods and heroes. gold adorned the monarch at every point. Bracelets shaped like coiled reeds ended in the heads of lions. Rings hung from his ears. A necklet bore the symbols of moon, sun, and storm. The sword at his side was a work of art, its hilt of ivory and gold, its sheath decorated with leaping beasts. When he took his seat upon the carved throne, shaded by attendants with fans, he seemed less a man than an earthly reflection of the divine powers. Around him stood the officers of the empire. The Tartan, commander of the armies, held the highest rank, assisted by other ministers who governed the palace, the treasury, and the temples. Courtiers filled the hall in long rows, their appearance stern and martial, arms bare to show the strength that had conquered so many nations. They were a people fashioned for war, confident and disciplined, accustomed to command. The Elamite envoys advanced between these lines with careful dignity. Their garments resembled those of their hosts, though less splendid, and among their attendants appeared men of many races, dark-skinned dwellers of the southern marshes, mountain tribes with fair hair and blue eyes, and nobles whose features mirrored the Assyrians themselves. All carried the pride of a land that had long resisted foreign domination, and some even hoped that their mission would fail, for they dreamed of seizing the wealth displayed before them. After the customary gifts were presented, the spokesman delivered his message. Peace, he said, existed between the two kingdoms, and Tuman wished to preserve it. Yet Assurbanipal sheltered men who had betrayed their lawful sovereign. If the exiles were surrendered, friendship would be secure. If not, war must follow. The answer had already been decided. To abandon guests who had trusted in his protection would stain the king's honour. Moreover, the memory of past struggles with Elam weighed heavily. Earlier monarchs had claimed victories that were in truth doubtful, and more than once Assyrian armies had returned from the east without triumph. The risk was great, yet the court believed that the gods favoured their cause and that the strength of the empire would prevail. Assurbanipal therefore refused the demand. The ambassadors were seized and detained as prisoners, a sign that the challenge was accepted. Only a few servants were allowed to return to the frontier bearing a letter that warned Tuman to abandon his designs or face the wrath of Assur and Ishtar. When the decision for war was finally sealed, Assurbanipal moved with the speed of a man who understood that hesitation could undo an empire. Before the sun had fully set on the day of the audience, the Tartan of the right, Belnahid, had already begun issuing commands. Couriers mounted their horses and rode out from the palace gates in every direction, carrying letters marked with the royal seal. These messages were not elaborate proclamations, but brief and precise instructions addressed to governors, generals, and allied rulers. The machinery of the state, long accustomed to conflict, shifted at once into its familiar rhythm. For centuries, Assyria had lived as a nation at arms. Peace was an interval, not a condition. The army, therefore, did not need to be created anew. It existed at all times, maintained by habit and necessity. Most of its soldiers were drawn from the heartland of Assyria and the districts of Mesopotamia that had belonged to the crown since remote generations. In every province, small detachments accompanied the governors as permanent garrisons. These troops formed the solid core around which larger forces could be gathered in moments of crisis, and their loyalty was rarely questioned. The greater part of the army, however, remained concentrated near the royal cities. Nineveh, Kalak, and the frontier regions facing Elam and Chaldea. From these centres, the regiments could be mobilised within days and sent across the empire with astonishing speed. Reinforcements joined the border garrisons, and together they usually formed an army large enough to confront any enemy in the field. Organisation was the true strength of Assyria, more than numbers alone. The troops stationed in distant provinces were used with caution. Their withdrawal often encouraged rebellion among recently conquered peoples, and for this reason, they were summoned only when disaster threatened or when heavy losses demanded new recruits. Every prolonged war carried the risk of weakening the imperial grip. The rulers of Nineveh knew this well, and it explained the ferocity with which they treated defeated cities. Mercy was considered a dangerous luxury. Houses were burned, fields destroyed, families scattered, and prisoners subjected to punishments meant to terrify entire regions into obedience. Power won by force could be preserved only by force. The greatest fear was not a single enemy, but a union of many. In earlier ages, such alliances had been almost impossible. Distant peoples had little knowledge of one another, and revolts erupted separately, allowing Egypt or Assyria to defeat them one by one. But the world had changed. Roads, traders, and messengers now linked kingdoms that had once seemed unimaginably far apart. Lydia spoke with Egypt, Egypt with Syria, Syria with the tribes of Arabia, and beyond them all stood Elam and Babylon, restless and watchful. If these lands ever struck together, the empire would face a storm unlike any before. Assyrian policy therefore aimed at preventing unity among its enemies. Spies listened in markets and temples, intercepted messengers, and sowed distrust between allies. Yet the danger remained. Each campaign against one frontier risked igniting another. The letters sent out after the audience urged constant vigilance. Governors were to report every rumour, every movement of armed men, every whisper of conspiracy. A single neglected spark might set the entire empire ablaze. While preparations advanced, Assurbanipal sought relief from the weight of his thoughts. Sleep avoided him, and he turned, as he often did, to the treasures of learning gathered in the palace. The king took pride not only in conquest, but in scholarship. He had ordered scribes to copy the ancient works of Babylonia and Chaldea, preserving hymns, histories, and legends on tablets of baked clay. These libraries were arranged with meticulous care, each series labelled by its opening words, so that a reader could follow a tale from tablet to tablet like chapters of a living memory. On this uneasy night, he asked for the records of his own reign, not to relive the strategies of war, but to remember the signs by which the gods had favoured him. The story of Gyges of Lydia was brought first, a reminder of how distant rulers had once bowed before Assyrian power. The narrative told how the Lydian king, guided by a dream sent from Assur, had sought alliance and victory in the name of Nineveh. Later he had turned aside, trusting in his own strength, and misfortune had overtaken him. Such tales reassured the monarch that divine justice still watched over the affairs of men. Yet it was the older myths that truly stirred his spirit. Among them, none moved him more than the tale of Ishtar's descent into the realm of death. The goddess, mourning her slain husband, had dared to cross the 7 gates of the underworld, surrendering her ornaments at each threshold until she stood naked before the Queen of Shadows. The story spoke of darkness where no bread was eaten and no light shone, where the dead wore feathers like birds, and dust lay upon the locks of every door. Ishtar suffered the torments of that place until the Lord of Wisdom sent a messenger to demand her release and the waters of life. Through divine command she returned to the upper world, and with her the seasons revived. The legend reminded Assurbanipal that even the mightiest must pass through trial before renewal. The librarian also brought forth the ancient epic of Gistubar, hero of a time when monsters still walked the earth. In those distant days, human-headed bulls and scorpion men haunted the mountains, and cities trembled beneath their step. Gistubar, exiled from his rightful throne, hunted these creatures as others hunted deer. A dream foretold his meeting with a powerful being, and the interpretation led him to seek Habani, a wild sage who lived among the animals. Through the cunning of two women, the recluse was drawn to civilization, and he became the hero's loyal companion. Together they overthrew the tyrant who had seized Uruk, and Gistubar reclaimed his heritage. His beauty and strength attracted the love of Ishtar herself, who promised him chariots of gold and dominion over kings. But the hero, mindful of the fate that had befallen her earlier lovers, rejected the offer with proud words. Enraged, the goddess sent a monstrous bull to destroy him. Hibani faced the creature and after a fierce struggle drove his dagger into its neck. The victory brought honor, yet also the shadow of divine anger. These stories, recited in the quiet chamber, were more than entertainment. They were mirrors in which a king could read his own destiny. Like Gistubar, Assurbanipal stood between favour and wrath, between triumph and the unknown will of the gods. The empire he ruled was vast, yet fragile as the thread of a dream. Beyond the eastern frontier, Tumen prepared his armies, and alliances shifted like sand in the wind. As the reader's voice faded, the night deepened over the palace roofs. The tablets lay upon the floor like silent witnesses of centuries. Somewhere in the stables, horses stamped, and in the courtyards, guards changed their watch. The machinery of war continued to turn, indifferent to legends or prayers. Whether the coming struggle would end in glory or ruin, only the unseen powers could know. For the moment, the king listened to the echoes of ancient heroes and sought courage in their distant footsteps, while the empire waited for dawn and the road to Elam. Yet the anger of Ishtar did not loosen its grip upon the hero. When no warrior could defeat him by strength of arms, the goddess sought a more silent weapon. Illness was summoned to finish what swords had failed to achieve, and a wasting disease crept across his body. His skin burned, his strength faded, and the shadow of death, feared even by the bravest, stood close beside him. The man who had wrestled lions now trembled at the thought of a power he could not fight. Once more, the gods intervened. In a troubled dream, they revealed a path to salvation. He was told that only one being could heal him, and perhaps even grant him life beyond the grave. Khasisadra, son of Ubaratutu. This ancient figure belonged to a world almost forgotten, the final ruler of the early kings who governed Chaldea in the age just after creation. When humanity had been condemned for its sins and the great flood was sent to cleanse the earth, he alone survived within a sacred vessel. From him, the world was reborn, and by divine decree he was later carried away, while still living to the mysterious gardens beyond the mouth of the Euphrates, where the blessed dwell in peace. Driven by hope and despair, the hero set out to find him. The journey was unlike any he had known before. Fortune, which had once guided every step, now abandoned him. Paths twisted into wilderness, landmarks vanished, and even his loyal companion could not protect him. The faithful Eabani, who had stood beside him in so many battles, fell to a monstrous creature more terrible than any they had faced. His spirit descended into the kingdom of Alat, the land from which no traveller returns. But compassion stirred among the gods. Hea, the wise creator, ordered his son Merodash to release the soul of the fallen warrior. Like a cloud of dust rising from the earth, Eabani was lifted to the heavens. There the gods welcomed him with feasting and honour. Reclining upon a rich couch, he drank the pure water reserved for the favoured dead and looked down upon the affairs of mortals. He saw the fate of those who perish in war, the mourning parents who cradle the lifeless head, the wife who weeps beside the body, the children crying for bread, while strangers consume the meal prepared in the fallen man's tent. Alone and burdened by grief, the hero resumed his quest. After long wanderings, he reached the mountains of Maz. where the sun itself rises and sets beneath the watch of scorpion beings. These guardians sent him to the boatman Arbel, who instructed him to build a vessel. 6 weeks later, the two set sail toward the dwelling of Khasisadra. Yet a river encircled the sacred garden, and no living mortal could cross it. Khasisadra, moved by the sight of such suffering, spoke to him from the far bank. He recounted the story of the flood and revealed the means by which the disease could be cured. More than that, he promised that if the trials were endured with courage, the gods would one day welcome the hero among the immortals. With this assurance, the tale of wandering reached its conclusion, and the champion of Uruk was destined to join the divine host. Through centuries, his memory lived on, not only in song but in stone and image. Artists carved him beside the winged guardians of palace gates, his mighty arms locked around the throat of a lion. Seals worn by ordinary people carried scenes from his adventures. The slaying of the heavenly bull, the meeting with scorpion guardians, the voyage along the Euphrates, the bitter quarrel with the goddess who both desired and hated him. Even if the words of the ancient poem were lost, these silent witnesses would still preserve the outline of his legend. In Assyria, knowledge of the future was sought as eagerly as tales of the past. The stars were believed to rule every corner of existence. Each luminous body in the sky possessed a spirit and a purpose, casting invisible rays that shaped the destiny of kings and shepherds alike. From the moment of birth, every person was bound to a guiding star whose power could not be escaped. Not only individuals, but entire nations were thought to stand beneath celestial guardians. The rise and fall of empires could be traced in the movements of planets and the changing faces of the moon. Astrologers, watching from the high terraces of temple towers, studied these signs with tireless devotion. Their records, gathered over generations, formed a science that promised to read the will of heaven. Yet the sky didn't always speak clearly. At the approach of war with Elam, clouds veiled the moon and frustrated observation. Reports reached the king from every city that the omens remained uncertain. Some saw this silence as a warning, and anxious whispers spread through markets and courtyards. Others searched for more hopeful meanings, finding comfort in rare alignments that seemed to foretell the downfall of the enemy. To guide such interpretations, vast collections of omens had been compiled since the earliest times. Tablets listed the meaning of every eclipse, every flash of lightning, every unusual colour in the sky. One month favoured sieges, another condemned them. Thunder on a certain day promised abundance. On the next, it threatened plague or earthquake. The people learned these signs as naturally as children learn the seasons. Above all, stood the ancient tables attributed to Sargon of old, a monumental work arranging centuries of observations into ordered law. Scholars consulted it whenever doubt arose, copying its judgments word for word to present before the throne. Through this tradition, the heavens became a second realm of governance, as binding as any decree. But the gods also spoke in dreams. The visions of the night were considered messengers from above, sometimes plain, often wrapped in symbols. Manuals taught how to prepare the mind for revelation through fasting and prayer. Amulets promised truthful sleep, and temples offered silent chambers where questions could be posed to the unseen powers. In moments of crisis, the king himself turned to these mysteries. When news arrived that the Elamite ruler had mocked the goddess and marched toward Assyria, he hurried to the sanctuary at Arbela. Beneath the trembling light of a single lamp, he poured out his fear and devotion. The statue of Ishtar was said to answer, assuring him of protection and victory. The struggle with Elam had ended on the open plains, yet war still smouldered in the tangled country of Gambel. There, Dunanu, its king, and the prince Kabuzuli refused to submit, drawing strength from a land that seemed designed to defy conquerors. Gambul lay where the Tigris and Euphrates dissolved into a maze of water and reeds, half solid earth and half shifting marsh. The people who lived on the firmer ground resembled the Chaldeans in many ways. They spoke the same tongue, honoured the same gods, and dressed in familiar fashion. Their fields yielded wheat and dates, and their towns were built upon raised mounds like those of Babylonia. Yet the nearness of Elam had hardened their temper, and warfare was as natural to them as trade. Beyond the villages stretched a very different world. In the marshes men lived as fishermen and hunters, scarcely touched by the habits of the cities. The delta was a living landscape, always changing as the rivers laid down new soil and the sea retreated. Here the earth sank below the level of the floods and turned to black mud. Pools of stagnant water lay between low islands, and everywhere rose walls of reeds taller than a man. Paths vanished beneath floating weeds, and the air hung heavy with fever. The homes of the marsh people were as simple as the land itself. Bundles of reeds were bent into arches and covered with mats smeared in clay. Boats, flat and shallow, served as roads. In time of danger, families slipped away into secret inlets, where even skilled soldiers could not follow. To fight here meant wading through mire that swallowed horses to the chest, hacking a passage through thickets where every shadow might hide an enemy. Victories brought little reward, and many veterans who had survived battles in distant mountains met their end in these silent waters. Among the states of this region, Bit Yakin had once been the most powerful. From there, Merodach Baladan had risen to seize Babylon and challenge Assyria itself. When at last he was driven out, he gathered his followers, carried off his household gods, and crossed the sea to the Elamite coast. Most kings would have allowed him to vanish beyond that horizon, for Assyrians had long feared the open water. The sea was a marvel glimpsed only at the edges of empire, and their own ships were clumsy rivercraft. Sennacherib refused to accept that limit. He resolved to pursue the exiles across the waves, a design without precedent in Assyrian history. To accomplish it, he needed vessels unlike any then available, on the Tigris or Euphrates. The Chaldean boats were broad and slow, unsuited to the currents of the Gulf. Yet during his campaigns in the west, he had seen the sleek galleys of Sidon, guided with confidence by Phoenician sailors. Among the captives taken in Syria, he found craftsmen capable of building such ships. 2 great yards were established, one on the Euphrates at Tel Barsip, using timber from the Cedar Mountains, and another at Nineveh on the Tigris, supplied from the forests of the northern highlands. Under Phoenician masters, new vessels took shape, long and narrow, with high prows and banks of oars. Assyrian soldiers, unaccustomed to the sea, learned to row and handle ropes. When the fleet was ready, it carried the army southward, and for the first time the power of Nineveh crossed the open water. These memories still lingered when the campaign against Gambul began. The marshes could not be conquered by infantry alone. Boats were gathered and detachments trained to fight upon the canals. Scouts moved ahead through channels bordered by reeds, seeking the hidden towns of the rebels. The main stronghold was Sapabel, a city half floating upon the water, protected by walls and by nature alike. To reach it, the Assyrians first sealed every approach. Earthworks were thrown up on the drier ground, and vessels patrolled the waterways to cut off escape. Engineers prepared their machines with patient skill. The ram, tipped with iron, was slung from a timber frame and pushed on wheels toward the gates. Mobile towers rose above the battlements, allowing archers to rain arrows upon the defenders. Sappers crept forward beneath wicker shields, loosening the foundations stone by stone. The siege moved slowly. From the towers, the Assyrians could see the roofs of Sapabel reflected in the water, while from the walls the rebels watched the forest of machines drawing nearer. Each day brought new assaults, and each night the marsh tried to swallow the works of the besiegers. At last, a breach was opened, and the garrison, exhausted by hunger and fear, could resist no longer. A procession of triumph moved through Nineveh, with the slow certainty of a tide that could not be resisted. Word of distant victories had already reached the city, yet seeing the proof with one's own eyes was another matter. The streets filled long before the first ranks appeared, and from rooftops, balconies, and crowded squares the people waited to witness what conquest looked like in flesh and iron. At the head came the instruments of war, reminders that power rested first on discipline and force. Captured chariots rolled forward, their paint scarred and their wheels still stained with foreign soil. Behind them walked the horses of Elam, smaller than the Egyptian breeds but strong and alert, their necks arched beneath unfamiliar bridles. A few camels followed, strange creatures to many in the crowd, their heavy feet silent against the stone. These were symbols of distant deserts and trade routes now claimed by another master. Then appeared the wealth taken from fallen cities. Servants carried statues of foreign gods, some fashioned from gold and silver, others from polished stone. There were bronze tripods, finely worked chairs, embroidered garments, and vessels that had once served in sacred rites. Bars of metal glinted in the sun, and the variety of goods told its own story. Wine from the western coast, textiles from the south, jewels from temples long since silenced. For the Assyrians, such displays justified the endless cycle of campaigns. War was not only glory but livelihood, a means to draw the riches of many lands into one treasury. The captives followed, a long and uneven column. Singers and musicians led them, still carrying their instruments as if ordered to continue a performance that no longer had an audience. Their melodies drifted through the noise of the crowd, thin and uncertain. Behind them walked the people of Elam and Gamble, nobles beside labourers, mothers beside soldiers, all reduced to the same condition. Their clothing was torn, their faces grey with dust, and yet many moved with a dignity that drew uneasy silence from those watching. Children clung to their parents, too young to understand the meaning of the march. The women looked ahead with guarded fear, uncertain whether they would become servants, concubines, or simply disappear into households far from home. Some of the men held their heads high, already calculating how to survive in a new order. Warriors hoped to be recruited into the Assyrian ranks, preferring the risks of battle to the slow death of servitude. One group commanded particular attention. The defeated leaders were forced to walk in full view, marked for humiliation. Chains bit into their flesh, and cords ran through pierced lips or noses so they could be led like animals. Yet they did not bow their heads. Among them, Dunanu carried the severed head of his ally Tuman, hung around his neck, a grim trophy imposed by his conquerors. His expression revealed nothing, as if pain and shame had been sealed behind a wall no spectator could breach. Such spectacles ended only one way. Assyria did not spare those who challenged its authority. Some prisoners were executed immediately, others reserved for public torment. The victorious king himself sometimes took part, blinding captives or ordering their deaths before the assembled court. These acts were meant as warnings, written not on tablets, but on living bodies. When the procession reached the palace, the city surrendered to celebration. For 7 days, food and wine flowed without limit. The gates stood open to all, and the courtyards became vast dining halls draped in coloured cloth. Bread vanished by the 1,000 loaves, and animals were slaughtered faster than they could be counted. The people drank beyond measure, and by the second day, Nineveh resembled a single intoxicated household, careless of tomorrow. Inside the royal halls, the nobility feasted with more restraint but no less indulgence. Tables were set with fruit and delicacies, while servants mixed potent wines with aromatic powders in great silver bowls. Musicians played to guests who no longer listened, and even the guards drank from heavy cups while leaning on their spears. The city celebrated victory as if excess itself were a form of gratitude to the gods. In the secluded gardens of the palace, the king accepted a quieter invitation. Beneath trellised vines, a couch had been prepared, and nearby a high chair for the queen. Fountains murmured among cypress and poplar, offering the illusion of peace after months of bloodshed. Yet even here, triumph demanded a reminder. From a branch hung the darkened head of Tumen, placed where the king could see it while he drank. The sight pleased him, and he raised his cup in mock salute as singers praised his deeds. The court poet recited the familiar litany. The king, born under divine favour, instructed in wisdom, master of bow and chariot, chosen by the gods to rule and conquer. Abundance was said to follow his reign like rain upon fertile soil, and no enemy could stand where Asyr and Ishtar walked beside him. Such words filled the hall while outside the city staggered through its festival. Yet beyond the walls other voices spoke differently. In distant Judah, a prophet imagined the same city, not in splendour but in ruin. He saw streets choked with corpses, towers crumbling like figs shaken from a tree, and merchants fleeing like insects before a rising sun. To him, the wealth of Nineveh was a fragile veil over violence, and the triumph of today only the prelude to a harsher judgment. For the moment, however, the empire seemed unassailable. Armies had returned laden with spoils, rivals lay broken, and foreign kings sent gifts instead of threats. The celebration continued, and the people believed that such power could endure forever. But empires rarely hear the warnings carried on distant winds, and the echo of victory often hides the first footsteps of decline.